And by the way, you can be tracked on an iPhone. So know that when you get into the smartphone world, that's what I try to tell young people. Hey, this opens up a world that you may not even know about as far as tracking and privacy concerns. So Apple is, good on them for saying what they're saying and doing what they're doing. But if they really want to lock this down privacy-wise, they need to do even more. And that would change a lot of their bottom line when it comes to that 30% that they take from the App Store, et cetera, et cetera.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Friday, December 9th installment of the Silicon Insider, the only uncensored look at business and life in Silicon Valley. My name is Mike Malone, and I'm here with special contributor Scott Budman, who you all know, technology reporter for NBC Bay Area. Our producer is Jordan Henderson. Our East Coast correspondent is Bob Grove, and our host, as always, is the Silicon Valley Business Journal. Okay, Scott, we got to talk about Elon because he's everywhere in the news right now. I don't want to talk about, the release of documents, internal memos about Hunter Biden's laptop. I think everybody knows all that stuff. And the city of San Francisco going after him for putting cots inside of the offices of Twitter for people to sleep. But there's other stuff going on in his empire that really isn't getting a lot of notice. One of them is there's a growing backlash at Tesla among employees and shareholders about whether he's taking his eye off the ball by doing too many things and spending way too much time being a media persona about Twitter and not taking care of the nuts and bolts of Tesla. EV sales have collapsed in China, which is going to hurt Tesla's bottom line. Meanwhile, one of the reasons Tesla isn't responding quickly is because they transferred the head man there in China to Texas because production is not ramping up as fast as it should or was expected. And now you're talking about a shareholder possible result, demanding a new person on the board and complaining that Musk is just not paying attention right now to his companies. What do you think? You buying that? You buying that argument?
Yeah, I think to an extent. I mean, you just mentioned 2 or 3 things that he has going on, and you dismissed them as, oh, everybody knows that. We've talked about that a lot. And those are the things that are in the news. So, yeah, I think if you're a Tesla shareholder, your big worry right now is that he's too distracted and perhaps spreading himself too thin. And, every once in a while we'll get, an event like recently Tesla came out and talked about its semi-trucks and the stock went up a bit. And it was like, he's focusing on Tesla again. But just a week later, he had an event where he talked about Neuralink, yet another company, to put chips in brains. I mean, at some point, the Tesla shareholder right now, who is, by the way, looking at a stock that's dropped consistently over the last year and is saying, hey, what about us?
$500 billion this year so far. That's a hell of a hit. So what does he do? I mean, he's even admitted he's being pulled pretty thin. And now he's got, people after him. He's got the city of the mayor of San Francisco. He's got Congress talking about investigations. He's got the media turning on him because, he's turned on them. This guy, how much bandwidth does a human being have? I mean, no matter how smart he is, there's only 24 hours in a day.
Right. I think we're finding that out, how much bandwidth he has. And part of it is because he decided to put so much of that bandwidth into Twitter. And Twitter, again, is an important company for journalists. I say this personally as someone who gets a lot of value out of it professionally. But the heat around Twitter and the news focus on Twitter is much larger, I think, than it deserves. It's just one of those companies that's amplified for several reasons, most recently because Elon Musk took it over. So all of that gets in the news and takes so much of his time. And it's one thing to say, I'm going to run Tesla and have, Gwen Shotwell run SpaceX, but sort of have a hand in that. Okay, I can see how that's all right. It's another thing to say, I'm going to run Tesla and maybe mess around with digging some tunnels and see how that goes. But when you're like, I'm going to run Tesla and run the company in the spotlight right now and spend all this money on it and spend all this, time on it and energy, I think the shareholders understandably are saying, again, what about us?
Yeah, and when you buy the media's megaphone, you got to expect it's going to get real noisy for quite a while after that, especially if you lay off half your people too, and they're posting comments everywhere. Did he make a mistake? You kind of suggested he was being very foolish, even getting involved with this, and then paying that amount of money.
Yeah.
Do you still feel that way, or is it you feeling a little better about his ownership?
It's not my position to say whether or not Elon Musk is making a mistake here, but he's clearly in over his head, both financially. He admits that now, that he overpaid. And I think the time that it's taking to do whatever it is that he's doing at Twitter, which, by the way, is also really enjoying the spotlight, which I think he does very much, but it is taking away from Tesla. I mean, it's taking away from running a company and adjusting to market changes, whether it's in China or here, or with the competition that's gearing up to do other EV things. But, Musk always seems to be reaching for several spotlights at the same time. This is someone who, while running Tesla and talking about the importance of the environment, was also talking a whole bunch of mess about Bitcoin and mining, which is terrible for the environment. And right. Somehow he had fans that followed him through both of those things. But at some point, you'd hope that there was just more focus on a mission. And I think that's just getting lost in, like you said, the megaphone right now that Twitter has over everybody.
Now, one of the biggest Tesla investors, a guy named Leo Kogwan, announced publicly Tesla's board is missing in action, meaning they're not being active in dealing with this situation right now. And he suggested a stock buyback. And then another investor, Ross Gerber, is calling for the board to add a director who would represent retail shareholders. I mean, he's heading for a shareholder revolt if he's not careful.
Yeah, and it's interesting because
more of a distraction.
Right. Well, look, I mean, you wouldn't think that Tesla was the kind of place that would have an activist investor. I mean, look at the last several years. The stock absolutely soared. It made the guy in charge the richest man in the world. It split 5-for-1, then it split 3-for-1. I mean, investors are really, really happy. And yet, I think it's ripe for an activist investor simply because the guy in charge is distracted. And that's sort of how this thing works. But you're right. Usually activist investors get involved when you've had many years of underperformance. And Tesla really hasn't had that until recently. But I think an activist investor could make a good case that you're right. The board has not been active enough. And Elon Musk has been too active in other pursuits.
And yet, in your heart, if they just delivered that first pickup truck sometime in the near future, the stock would go soaring again.
Yeah, and then people would be waiting for the second one, which would be behind schedule, and then the 400th, which would be behind schedule. I mean, we've seen
leaving their deposit for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we got to talk about Sam Bankman-Fried, Mr. SBF. If you want to know the power of social media, on Wednesday, House Financial Services Committee Chair Maxine Waters, we all know who she is, told a group of Democrats that she doesn't plan to subpoena former FTX CEO Sam Bankman-Fried. Chaos on the web. She's just covering for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party doesn't want to have anybody talking to one of their biggest donors, blah, blah, blah. Well, all hell broke loose. Thursday, she announced, well, no, his testimony is on the table. It's a possibility. I mean, I really think that the Army of David's actually changed a senior member of the House's position on an important topic.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this around Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, I think, is noise. And it's noise that we have to get through to get to where we inevitably are going, which is both him testifying on Capitol Hill, but also, I believe, a court case, a fraud case.
Absolutely.
I don't think I'm right. And so the rest is just noise. And I'm surprised that there has been this much noise. I mean, he's been going against his lawyer's advice and giving all these interviews, which are also inevitably going to come up in a court case. So I think right now it's just the storm before the calm, and the calm is going to be him in a chair, perhaps even in a suit, facing off against lawmakers and then lawyers.
lawmakers, and then the forensic auditors. No one's really noticing this, but they're out there looking, trying to find where that money went. And Sam, as usual, he put his foot in his mouth again, made himself even more legally vulnerable. I think it was just yesterday. He said, yeah, he admitted that FTX didn't segregate client funds. I think that's called misappropriation of funds or even embezzlement. I mean, if you're trying to add decades to your sentence, you just say things like that. I mean, that's an invitation for class action suits, criminal penalties, everything else.
I mean, everything in crypto seems to be a lesson learned that, was just sort of overlooked. And one of these lessons that should have been learned was, hey, this crypto exchange had a hedge fund on the side. That's not a good recipe.
Girlfriend's hedge fund.
Anything but really strong financial management. And all this stuff is going to come up. I mean, it's going to come up on Capitol Hill, but I also believe it's going to come up in a courtroom.
Oh, I have no doubt. Speaking of courtrooms, your old friend, Sonny Balwani, got sentenced this week. 13 years.
Yeah, just spent a day in the courtroom. And, it was a bit of a surprise. The COO getting more time, sentenced to more time in jail than the CEO. But then again, Balwani was found guilty of 12 counts. They had him in the lab as well as, with the investors. It was the investors that fraud that got Elizabeth Holmes, but they really ran the table on Balwani. He didn't stand a chance. He was presented by the Dark Lord, not only by the attorneys, but the press. I mean, everybody looked at him and said, "Okay, I can kind of forgive Elizabeth Holmes, the blonde hair and all that." He looked like a bad guy out of a movie. Unfortunately for him. Yeah, I mean, Holmes took what didn't keep her from getting a very long sentence, but what did help her in the public eye, I believe, by testifying. And I remember I was there tweeting out, sentence by sentence, and the stuff that came back was the usual vitriol, hey, this is someone who committed fraud, but also there was a humanity to it. Balwani didn't do it. Not only did he not testify in his trial, but when he had a chance to stand up, as you do during your sentencing, to sort of mea culpa things, he didn't. So we still have not heard word one from Sonny Balwani, either during his trial or his sentencing. And so there's no humanity. He didn't humanize himself, and he just didn't take any advantage of the chance to, I guess, become known beyond the significantly older boyfriend and co-conspirator in this fraudulent venture.
Well, it sounds like we're not going to hear from him now until about 2035.
Right, probably not. Correct.
Do you know where he's going? Same place as Holmes?
I do not. And on the news, one of the newscasts I was on last night was with a lawyer who's followed this, and he said there are a few possibilities, but he doesn't know which one. It is white collar crime, so it's not like he's going to San Quentin.
Yeah, but playing ping pong for 15 years. He get very good at ping pong.
Yeah.
Were you in the courtroom when this happened?
Yes.
What was the reaction compared to the Holmes verdict?
It was much more muted, partly because the courtroom was absolutely packed to the gills during the Holmes verdict, and her family was there, her loved ones. It was a sad scene pretty quickly. With Balwani, there was some family behind him, but they too were quiet and reserved. He stood, staring forward for a while before even turning around. It seems to take a minute for this to sink in. As someone myself who's tweeting things out and yet is not good at math, the judge, bless him, each time he announced the sentence would announce it in months. And so with Holmes, it was 135 months. And I admit I froze, like, what does that mean exactly? And I'm having to...
Break out your phone.
Yeah.
Where's that calculator function?
Right. And I noticed as he said, okay, here's the sentence, several of us did pull out our phones to the calculator function to try to figure this out. You know what we do for a living, and it's not mathematics. But there was just that minute of letting it sink in. Wow, 13 years. And possibly thinking, most white collar things don't go to court. People settle, they get a couple of years, they move on. This is 13 years of a sentence. And then turning around and sort of, having some hugs with the family. But it was quieter because it also there wasn't as much press there either. There just wasn't as much attention on the Balwani portion of the trial as there was for Holmes.
Is there going to be a financial penalty phase too? Does he have to pay restitution like Holmes did?
Yeah, and they announced, as they did for Holmes, for Balwani, that would come at a later date. And it didn't sound like the prosecution for each of them wanted 800 million in financial restitution. The judge made it clear it would be significantly lower than that, but that would also be determined at a later date.
Okay. Let's move to interest rates. There's two rates that everybody's looking at right now. One of them is the Fed, and they seem to be beginning to plateau out in these increases in the rate. But the second one is the interest rate on 30-year fixed rate mortgages, which usually moves in tandem with the Fed. And it has dropped, interestingly. It's gone the other direction the last month. It went from 7.16% to 6.4%. Is that good news? Is that going to sell one more house, that little bit of difference?
It may still be too high for that, especially here in the Bay Area, where it's one thing to have, the average price, say for San Francisco, be like 1.4 million right now. But that was when mortgage rates were 3% and lower. Even at high 6%, I don't think so. They went, if you think about it, up, it seemed to me, even faster than the interest rates. And I don't mean just by a percentage, but people were looking at the interest rates as, okay, this is going to gradually make saving money a little more advantageous and hopefully slow down the economy very gradually. But it felt like the mortgage rates went up really significantly. And
mortgage rate didn't care. It was going to climb no matter what.
Right. And so I think that the turn down in that is important. Also, by the way, gas prices are now lower than they were a year ago, both in California and for the nation. And that's significant for the day-to-day commuter. But for the mortgage rate, I think it's just going to take time, because we've seen the prices drop for housing, but not by enough to really get people off the sidelines, especially with a 6.5, almost 7% mortgage rate. It's still really, really pricey out there.
Well, they may get off the sidelines sometime about a year and a half from now. I mean, the latest consensus seems to be home values in the Bay Area will continue to fall in 2023, maybe right through most of the year. And because we had such incredibly high real estate prices, they're expected to fall a lot more than the rest of the country comparatively. We have a long ways we can go down. And in the meantime, you're still going to pay probably the same property tax. I think the most hated man in the Valley pretty soon is going to be Larry Stone, our assessor, who I've happened to have known since I was a little boy. But Larry had to send out a message saying we're on top of it. Don't be surprised, because of Prop 13, you've been getting a very, very, very low assessment, even though your house is worth, maybe your assessment was $1 million and your house is worth 4.5 now. And their housing price falls to 2. You're going to still pay the assessment on that million.
Right. So we don't have to get too into the woods here, but you're right, into the weeds here. Yeah, it's still high, but because of Prop 13, it's not as high as it could have been, especially if you retain ownership of the home. I've interviewed Larry Stone many times, and he's cool with being the most hated man. He gets it. He thrives on it. He's like, look, I'm just taking care of business. And by the way, business is good. And I get it. They're still raking in a lot of property tax.
He's still the most powerful Democratic broker in town, Democrat Party broker. He's the man who makes the stars. So he's still
tried to bring the Oakland A's to the South Bay. Remember, he was the.
I remember well. I wish he had pulled it off.
Yeah.
I think I didn't toilet paper his house when I was 12, but okay. Next, and we'll close with this on the privacy front. Apple has not had a good week because of the China situation. And you get the feeling Tim Cook looked around and said, we're taking a lot of heat for this. So one of the things he did was he did the opposite of what people thought. He didn't reinstitute that communications app on iPhones in China. He just extended that control to the rest of the world. So I don't know if bringing us down to the lowest common denominator was a great solution, but it still doesn't look like he's picking out China. But the interesting news was, he also added he's going to cut back on manufacturing in China, which I think is really good PR for Apple. But the big thing was he has extended end-to-end encryption on the iCloud, which is a big deal. I mean, if I think privacy is the single most important story of our time. And Apple is going retrograde to all of the other companies we know, which are surrendering people, are capturing and stealing people's privacy. Apple's going the other way, which, I salute the guy for doing that. I mean, I hope it's a step that other companies follow.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, especially if you think about what they were facing in China, which you said at the top of that paragraph, it's been an extraordinary PR week for Apple. Think about it. They talk about end-to-end encryption. Everybody loves that, even while talking about the China situation. But also, I think the real coup de grace for Apple and Tim Cook this week was the press conference in Arizona saying, we are going to manufacture chips and use chips in our devices, all devices across the spectrum of Apple devices that are made in America. And you talk about getting a lot of press attention. This is, and we've talked about this before, foreign manufacturing, Chinese manufacturing versus American manufacturing, the one thing on this earth that brings the left and the right together. And who knew that Tim Cook could be that guy? But when he says, we're going to use chips manufactured in Arizona, and TSMC is involved, AMD is getting involved very wisely, and this is just a great move. At this point, it's a great PR move. It would be nice to see.
I don't care if it's a distraction.
Right.
It's good news. It's really good news. The fact that we gave up the crown jewels of modern American manufacturing, semiconductors, was insane. And we're pulling back now and regaining that control, which I think it's as important as the military in terms of, we have to have our own operations. We have to control that sector of the economy.
Right. And for now, again, it's a PR move. We can't wait to see this actually happen and come to fruition. But it's a big move. And I think it was a big PR week for Apple because of it.
Yeah, now let's talk about end-to-end encryption, because there are some naysayers who are saying, yeah, you get more privacy and security and all that, but what about law enforcement? What if we want to, like the case down south, what if we want to tap into the iPhones of a serial killer or somebody who shoots up a school or something? This encryption is going to make that more and more difficult. And so we get into this safety versus privacy. And I come down very strongly on privacy. I mean, if you want to intrude on my private information, get a court order. You can't just be the FBI and march in and say, turn over all your records. But I understand safety too. If some of these guys is loose, we want to be able to get them fast, and getting a court order takes time. And so there's that balance there. I mean, where do you stand on this?
Well, look, this is not new for society. This is not new for Apple. Remember, Apple did fight this exact battle because of the shooting that you just referenced. And yes, the response was overwhelmingly in favor of Apple protecting privacy and saying there's not going to be a backdoor for the government, for law enforcement. And sure, that's controversial, but Tim Cook is no dummy. He saw the reaction to that. And you started seeing outside CES big ads. What happens on the iPhone stays on the iPhone. This was a big, big move for Apple. And remember, it even took it further and said apps can't track you. And that, it cost Facebook, $10 billion that day or something like that? Yeah. And Zuckerberg has even called it out. And so Apple has weighed this and has really, really come out, at least in the public eye, much more strongly because of it. So I don't expect them to change or waver on their privacy policy, because they've been down this road and fought this battle, and they emerged from the battle saying, whoa, people really, really love our stance. And so I don't expect that stance to change.
I think it's going to be huge for their business. I mean, I've got to the point I'm ready to buy an iPhone just because of that. This is a Mac I'm talking on, but the idea that there's one island of security for my privacy out there in the world, I'm going to go live on that island. Especially in a world where the Chinese government is watching our kids every keystroke on TikTok. I mean, if that isn't terrifying, and perhaps the United States, the Congress is going to actually ban TikTok in the U.S. I've seen it. I guess it's in Florida right now. It's banned. I'm worried about this. I'm worried that we are surrendering so much that we're losing our liberty.
Well, and look, that's part of the thing when you get an iPhone. You know, if you get an iPhone and you go on TikTok, okay, where's the privacy? If you get an iPhone and you go on Facebook, where's your privacy? So, and by the way, you can be tracked on an iPhone. So know that when you get into the smartphone world, that's what I try to tell young people. You know, hey, this opens up a world that you may not even know about as far as tracking and privacy concerns. So Apple is, you know, good on them for saying what they're saying and doing what they're doing. But if they really want to lock this down privacy wise, they need to do even more. And that would change a lot of their bottom line when it comes to that 30% that they take from the App Store, et cetera, et cetera. It's just not a private world anymore.
Well, maybe we should pray that Apple has another bad week and Tim Cook has to throw another Hail Mary out there.
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, I do appreciate what they're doing.
Be more responsive than Mark Zuckerberg, for example.
Right. Right.
So anyway, that's it for now, folks. You can find us on the Silicon Valley Business Journal homepage, as well as on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, LinkedIn, and of course, YouTube. Have a great weekend. Stay dry, around here at least. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.